Good day, viewers. Pwalpar here. Today's story I'll share with you. Christmas Memories by Walter Parks. Today was Christmas Day 2024. I'm 77 years old, and I will turn 78 in just a few months. During my lifetime, I've had some great Christmas memories and some that were not so great to remember, as it invokes the pain you felt at the time. In no way can I elaborate on all of them. The happy memories fade into oblivion with time, and one tends to forget those memories. But some of the painful memories are burned into my brain. I couldn't forget them if I tried. One rarely forgets the painful memories. At least that's been my life's experience. Today being Christmas, two painful memories are on my mind, so I will share those with you. There have been far more than two that weren't so great, but today I'll limit my blog to just two. The first one occurred some 70 years ago on Christmas Eve in 1953 or 1954. What could possibly stick in a 6-year-old boy's memory for so long? As adults, we rarely consider how things can affect a child's mind, but I assure you a child's mind is fully developed at that age. I briefly encourage my readers to think twice about how you treat a child. Words and feelings can and often do affect a child's mind for a lifetime. My brothers and I lived that time in a small town in McRae, Georgia with our mother, who depended on a $50 monthly support check from our father. We lived in a rural sawmill community. I think the sawmill was called the Shepherd Lumber Company, but memories do fade with time, so don't quote me on the name of the lumber company. We lived in a row house, sometimes referred to as a shotgun house. I think they were called that because if you fired a shotgun in the front door, it would probably exit right out the back door. In any event, I include a link that would show basically what they would look like. Being a 6 or 7-year-old boy, I was at the time fully aware that our living situation was less than one would really desire. Basically, what I'm saying is we were very poor, and I was fully aware that we existed in less than normal living conditions. It rarely bothered me that we lived that way, as much of my time was spent playing out of doors with no concern for our situation. I was totally unaware that we were looked down upon by those who lived in better financial conditions, but I was soon to realize it and feel for the first time the hurt a child can feel. You may well picture me in your mind. I was a barefoot boy, often clad with nothing but a pair of tattered short pants, who played in the dirt road and ran by the house, and often would play in the ditch where a small creek ran, sometimes digging up crawfish and tadpoles and frogs. It didn't take much to keep us entertained. I recall we were often hungry and never seemed to have much to eat. Somewhere in the basement, I have some old black and white photos of us. We were extremely skinny, and it's apparent by looking at those just how malnourished we were. But at the time, we were oblivious to the fact. I tend to ramble, but I'm getting into the memory that caused me the grief. There came a Christmas that I remember vividly. There would be no Christmas for us that year. It hurt to see the other children playing with the gifts they received. I felt sad about it. We were out playing that Christmas Eve in the dirt road in front of the house. A man came down the road in a beat-up old black pickup truck. The black truck was piled with gifts for some of the neighbors' children in the area. I presumed he was from a local church or some charity organization. The neighborhood kids came out, and he distributed the stuff to those children. I stood there watching the truck get empty. When it was empty, He looked over and saw us sitting there, looking quite dejected. I presume he felt some pity for us, so he looked in the truck and found a bag of fruit. I think it was apples and oranges. The man called me over and handed me the fruit. It made me feel like I was unworthy to be treated like the other kids. I politely told the man, "Thank you," and took the fruit in to give it to my mother and brothers. But the pain I felt when it dawned on me just how low on the totem pole we were. I felt that pain for many years. Our maternal grandparents lived nearby in a much nicer house. My Aunt Inez and Uncle Ben and their son Wayne were in town to share Christmas with my grandparents, as well as my Uncle Alonzo and Aunt Hazel and their 3 kids, Donnie, Terry, and I cannot for the life of me remember their daughter's name. We were reluctantly invited as well to share Christmas with them. We children were all about the same ages, and with the exception of Wayne, who was 12 or more, I recall it was the first time we had spent the night inside our grandparents' house. Being a sawmill man, my grandfather, Walter Spires, was a woodman. He knew where to find Christmas trees as well as holly trees that they usually decorated every year. So they were set up in the family room. We were told, "You kids better get to bed early because Santa Claus will be here soon." We were put to bed. Most of the children were very gleeful about it. I, however, was very skeptical about the whole situation. I lay there in the dark listening and very much awake. The adults were out in the lighted family room chatting and sharing eggnog or some other Christmas cheer. Soon the other kids were sound asleep, but not Walter. In a while I heard Uncle Ben tell my cousin Wayne to go see if all them kids were asleep. Wayne came to each child to see if they were asleep. When he got to me, I closed my eyes and did some serious pretending. He got right up in my face because he was apparently unsure of whether I was asleep or not. He returned to the front room and proclaimed that yes, indeed, all the children were asleep. Soon there was much commotion out there. I got up and went to the doorway to the lighted room and watched as the aunts and uncles spread out the gifts for their children all around the trees, with the exception of my mother, who was sitting nearby watching the proceedings. I immediately realized my brothers and I were to be left out, or at least treated as less worthy of important considerations. I reluctantly retired to bed with less than high hopes for Christmas morning. In the morning I watched as the children, mostly a bit younger than I, gleefully examined all the gifts. There were lots of wrapped gifts as well as bicycles and some new clothes and such. I was handed 2 gifts. One was a toy pistol, the other one was a pack of firecrackers with a box of matches. In short order, I left the gleeful celebration in the house and went outside. I thought about it for a while. I felt the pain of not being worthy of much. I stuck a firecracker in the barrel of the pot metal pistol. Really just a cap gun's all it was. Lit the fuse, held it away from my face. It exploded, splitting the barrel open just a little bit. A few explosions later and I had the toy gun sufficiently destroyed. It didn't take me long to use up the matches and firecrackers either. A conversation in the house that day may have gone something like this. Possibly my granddaddy talking to my grandma. That ungrateful boy went out there and blew up his toy pistol we bought him. Enough said about that Christmas memory. The second Christmas memory I share occurred later in my life. To briefly update the story, I look back a few years when I was around 9 or 10 years old. My father came and got me and my younger brother Bobby and took us to live in Florida with him. leaving behind my mother and baby brother Kenneth. There we got to know our stepmother Helen. She was a very sweet lady who treated us like we were two of her own children. She already had 5 of her own, all older than I, by her first husband, who was now deceased. Her youngest child, Aggie, was 5 years older than me. Her real name was Mary Agnes. She referred to as Aggie, but we called her Mary Agnes for years. I think mostly just to aggravate her. The first thing she, being a teenager, did was greet us with a big wet kiss and hug. I recall being a bit embarrassed by that, as I wasn't used to getting a kiss from anybody. But the deal was sealed, however. She was then and forevermore my sister. I recall it felt good to have a sister and other sisters and brothers as well. My father was a very strict man who rarely openly showed any affection towards us, but we were accepted into the family and I wasn't made to feel unwelcome or unworthy by any of Helen's children, who were mostly living out on their own anyway, with the exception of my stepbrother David, who was a couple years older than Mary Agnes. It wasn't too long before David was off and gone to the Navy. When his Navy hitch was over, he married a sweet girl down the street whose name was Dolores. We call her to this day Dolly. He was then off and on his own as well. I tend to stray from my story. I will get back to the subject. I in particular became very attached to Helen, even though I did miss my birth mother. A couple of years prior to our going to live with my father in Florida, my mother had married a man by the name of George Wright. He was never accepted by us, in particular because we were ordered to refer to him as Daddy, and that was Aiken, South Carolina, where that occurred. I remember one instance that sticks in my brain. We were in the back seat of George Wright's car listening as my real father was standing outside the car asking if he could visit with us for a few hours. I heard my father ask, "Can I see the boys for a while?" It was like George Wright was delighting in his power over the situation. Without thinking, I recall asking out loud while addressing George Wright, "Can we go, Daddy?" Whereupon it dawned on me I was talking about my real daddy while referring to a man I couldn't stand as Daddy. I knew immediately how it must have felt to my father to hear his kids refer to someone else as Daddy. In fact, I felt quite ashamed. I'm certain that's why we referred to Helen by her name rather than calling her mother. I explained to her at the time, and she understood why. Her understanding and excellent care she took of us only made me love her more. She took great care of us, often defying my strict father when it was wrong about things, which he often was. The second memory I share is about my stepmother Helen. In a few years passed and I was married and off on my own, but many weekends were spent visiting and staying with Helen and my father. She loved the Blue Ridge Mountains, and many a day I took her for drives in the mountains and spent time with her. I will briefly share a short story on one such occasion when I was driving her through the mountains. We were way up the side of a mountain near Cooper's Creek, driving a dirt road with no other vehicles or people to be seen for miles. We were just driving along, taking in the changing of the leaves, color, and talking when she announced she couldn't wait and needed to tinkle. No one in sight for miles, and the nearest bathroom probably 15 miles away. I pulled over close to a clearing by the road. "You can go over there," I said. "Just watch where you step. I will stand by my car with my back turned. Shout if you have any problems." I doubt any cars will come by. Soon she returned and we were back off on our excursion towards Cooper's Creek. As you take that road all the way, you wind up in a town called Blairsville, Georgia, with paved roads all the way back to Morganton, Georgia, where her home was. Little did I know at the time she had managed to get in some poison ivy when we stopped by the road. I'm sure it takes some time to heal from that incident, but it did not deter her love for the mountains. She was diabetic and had serious medical complications with it. Her last drive through the mountain was with me, bringing her home from a week's stay in a hospital in Gainesville, Georgia. She asked me to drive back by way of Highway 60 straight through the mountains, and I accommodated her request, even though I knew she didn't feel good. A week or two later, she was back in the hospital and very ill. It was Christmas week, sometime in the mid-1970s. All of her children had been summoned, and we all knew it was nearly her time here on Earth. We just didn't know when that would be. It was Christmas Eve, and I didn't want to leave her bedside, but since we lived within driving distance of there, we were encouraged to go home for the night. I had brought her some Christmas presents that were there in the room, but I doubt she ever got to open them. Okay, I relinquished. We will go home tonight. I will return tomorrow. I leaned over her and gave her a big gentle hug and whispered in her ear, "I love you, Mother." Her eyes teared up and she smiled as I kissed her on the cheek. I exited the room never to speak to her or even see her again. She passed during the night, and the next day when I returned, I was encouraged by my brother Bud not to see her but to remember her as she was. I went to a private room and cried for a long time. When I returned, she was gone and off to be cremated. A couple of months passed when my last dealings with Helen occurred. She was to be buried on a date that I can't quite remember, when the ground was thawed out in the spring up in New Hampshire. My father was to take her cremated remains to the town where her sister Doris still lived at the time. It was Concord, New Hampshire. I told my father I would be there for her burial. We left a week earlier and stayed in Philadelphia with my mother-in-law and father-in-law for a week. We drove then to New Hampshire. She was interred in an Episcopal cemetery there in Concord, New Hampshire. I took her container, which held her remains, and I knelt down by a 3-foot deep hole that was next to her mother's grave marker. I gently placed the urn down in the hole and whispered once more to her, "I love you, Mother." Thanks for listening.